How did you get to this space?
I got to the space, I went to the second night of Statements, with yourself and Yvonne and Athol. It blew me away, because I'd come from Dublin, which at that stage had 17 fully working theatres. And I arrive in Cape Town, and there's the Little and there's the Nico. So I thought I'd really fallen among thieves. You know? This was in 1970. And then the space opened. So I missed the opening night. I went to the second night. And a year later, I was in a play there, because Brian had got rights to Hugh Leonard's The Padraig Pearse Motel, which is a hilarious farce. And he wanted an Irishman. So Sybil Sands knew me. She said, go along to Brian. And I did an audition, which blew him away. So 3 weeks later, I was in The Padraig Pearse Motel. My first professional acting role. Great fun. Loved it.
When did you arrive from Ireland, in fact?
In the end of 1970.
What struck you about the apartheid laws and this?
Appalling. I mean, I followed a woman out here, so I have no excuse, you know. But it was appalling. The segregation was so palpable. There were no blacks in town, except during the day as messengers. They all disappeared at night. The coloured mixed-race people had to get out of town, couldn't stay in town. It was very, very oppressive. So when the space came along with this wonderful trick of charging £1.50 admission fee and 50 cents for a 24-hour membership of the Space Club, this was the answer to get, and that's why we had such wonderful plays there. And we got permission where no other theatre in South Africa would get permission. I also think the government treated it as a bit of a safety valve, because we were, after all, a small audience talking to ourselves. I said in one of my reviews, 2 rand for a liberal trip. And I think the authorities tended to view it like that. Every so often they'd step in, they'd ban something. But I think generally speaking, they let us a short leash.
But at the time, were you nervous about the police?
Yeah, well, in 70 they weren't as horrendous as they became in the 80s, but there was always that sinister sort of in the background, that sort of, that control, that sense of control, and the sense of fear, the lack of communication across the colour line. And I was in advertising, and there was a snow white industry, except again for the messengers, and no segregation at all, no drinking together, none of that. That was very, very obvious and very oppressive.
What are the other plays that you did in the space?
That was my first one, and then I did a couple of space benefits, which you compared. We made a lot of money for the space. These mad occasions, I dressed up as Maura Fine in one of them and sauntered around in one of her numbers in a wig. I did Lysistrata, which is the first multiracial show since Wait a Minute, which had happened about 15 years before that. And that was great fun. There was a big cast for the space. There was a cast of about 17 or 18 people, full musical.
What, a letter was in that one, letter of a sad note?
No, she wasn't. Jackie Singer played Lysistrata, or Liza as I called her. Because I transported Lysistrata with the theme of the women saying to the men of Sparta and Athens, no sex until you stop fighting. And it worked beautifully here.
Okay, so, I thought that a letter was in it and that Toko was in it.
Toko was in it. Toko was in it. And Robin Smith. And then I did You'll Come to Love Your Sperm Test. John Antrobus's piece of nonsense, which is great fun, with Bill Flynn, and Paul was in that, and Robin again, and I can't remember the rest of the cast. Well, and that memorable performance, I came close to making Bill Flynn corpse, which is quite an achievement. That was great fun, very rude but lovely.
Sad about Bill, though, not being with us anymore.
Yeah, it is, yeah, and sad where he went to. Pressure of that show that nobody wanted to see. Says something about theatre now.
I don't know about that, I don't know what I want to.
Well, he was trying to put on, funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. He didn't get the crowds. And
so then go on with the play, your list of plays?
And then I did, I've drawn a blank.
1,000 Clowns?
You and my son,
yes,
in 1,000 Clowns. You got the rights to 1,000 Clowns. And then you and Brian, I met you and Brian at the Baxter, whatever it was, and you saw Russell, who was at that stage about 14 and very small, he looked about 11, and your eyes went ching, and you used him in 1,000 Clowns. And I acted in that play with him and you. That was great fun.
It sounds, like you saw most of the stuff at the space.
I didn't miss a show, I don't think.
What were the outstanding memories for you?
Well, on a personal level, when my Lysistrata, which was a very naughty play, sex was its topic. We cleaned up the language a bit because we were already taking a risk with a mixed audience and a mixed cast. And then one night, 2 stony-faced men came in and sat on the second row, just inside the door. And they sat through the first act without an expression on their faces. And we were convinced they were security police. So at the interval, they got up and they walked down the stairs. And one of the girls who worked there, I can't remember her name, couldn't stand it. She ran after them. So, who are you? It turned out they were 2 Portuguese sailors, who didn't understand a word of English. And they sat through this nonsense. So I thought I was going to go down in history having one of my works banned. But it wasn't to be. And then I did the final sting of the Dying Wasp, which closed the space. I also did Mitzi Blitz, which closed the People's Space. So don't hire me to write plays. I closed theatres. But they were highlights.
The ones with real impact.
Yeah. Well, Lysistrata had a huge impact. It was a musical. People were dancing it was joyous, night after night. Alan Heyman, who was the composer, and he had a small band, he would just play this music, and people would rise to their feet and dance in the aisles and on the stage. And poor old Charlie Common came around we thought it was a joint, and we were all sucking on this thing and getting high. It turned out it was a herb cigarette, and we all got stoned on it.
Was there any play that changed you? Any play that you saw that made you aware of what was going on in this country?
Not any individual play. The type of plays that were mounted there all the time were pushing against the ropes, pushing against the boundaries, pointing out the evil society that we were in. Whether it was Woody Allen, Don't Drink the Water, or whether it was Lysistrata, whatever it was all the time pushing against this. And even the fact if we got the rights to do a Joe Orton play or a Herbie, what was his name? Herb Gardner, a play, we knew that we were privileged to do it because we were the only theatre in South Africa who was allowed to do it. So there was that sense of subterfuge, a sense of cocking a snook at authorities. And every banning that came out, and several of the plays were banned, we felt a joy, a disappointment for the actors and concern, but a joy that we were actually making some sort of difference. What difference? In the absolute, I don't know what difference we made. As I say, maybe it was a liberal trip. I think we changed a lot of people's mind. We certainly gave black actors a chance to perform, which they never had up until then, and all through that dark period. And they'd stay upstairs in the space in those god-awful rooms upstairs because it was dangerous on a Friday night to go home, back into the townships after a performance. So we were aware of all this sort of stuff.
You mentioned that you were the only theatre, or Space was the only theatre that could do plays by authors like Herb Gardner. Could you explain what... There was a boycott and so on. Could you explain that situation?
Well, most people, especially Woody Allen was a typical example. He refused to have his film shown in South Africa. He refused to have his plays performed in South Africa. And then Brian contacted him and gave him a rundown of the space, and he got permission. This happened time and time again, that people would allow it for the space because they knew it was playing. They knew the difficulties that we were under. This subterfuge of having a 24-hour membership of the space, and therefore that made it, ergo, a private performance, and we could allow all sorts of people in. They knew it was a game, but it was reaching out to people, and it was at the stage where the black people wanted a voice because it was the beginning of the protest theatre, which I still think was the finest time in South African theatre. Where is it now, I ask myself, and I don't see it. But then the protest, a lot of the stuff was raw. There were shouts of anger and rage coming from the townships and the Cape Flats, and the space was the venue in which they could do that. They could, as Athol said, at the space they had the right to fail. And they came out with some terrible stuff. But because of its raw energy, Rosa Albert was one. that came out. It just blew me away. This new voice I'd never heard before, because I'd never heard African theatre before I came here.
So what was the name of the play?
Woza Albert. And then again, of course, when I get a phone call on a Saturday morning from Brian, be at the Space 2:30 this afternoon. So I went. Who was there? John Carney and Winston Atsona, performing illegally out of the Serpent Players in East London, doing Sizwa Bansi is Dead. I'd never seen such powerful acting talent. It was amazing. When he sat there, John, and opened that day's newspaper, the Cape Times, and read it as a black man, and found every article in it funny. And he could communicate that black perspective. Had the audience in stitches, so much so he wouldn't stop. And I saw this performance, Winston standing up at the top of the steps, because there was theatre in the round, waiting for his cue. He wasn't going to get a cue from John. And then suddenly a foot comes out and pushes him down the stairs. It was Brian pushing onto the stairs after about 20 minutes. And by the time he'd reached the bottom of the stairs, John was out of that character and into the character of the play. Amazing stuff. And then after that, they did Hadasha Span. Remember that? It was called, we couldn't call it the island because you couldn't mention the island. The island, Robben Island, was painted out of postcards, for God's sake. Hadasha Span. In one of it, I swear, Winston's eye swole up. It actually got 4 times bigger. John reaches inside his trousers, wheezes in his hands, and bathes his eye. And it's theatre in the round, and I'm sitting in the front row. I was terrified. I'd never seen such courage on the stage in my life. So what's this guy going to do next? John had that power then, that rawness, that energy, that fearlessness. Astounding stuff at the Space. Nowhere else.
Well, those for me were milestones in my career at the Space. Watching those 2 plays, they actually turned my life around. I mean, you saw, you know, we all knew it was around. We knew it was happening. We heard about people falling out of windows and so on. But we didn't know the minutiae.
Yeah.
You know, those things that, you know, working on the island, that the scene starting with the 2 wheelbarrows.
Yeah, that went on for about 10 minutes. Nothing happening. But the tension in that theatre was palpable.
Could you just tell us about the 2 wheelbarrows? I mean, starting with it as an anecdote, when you saw the island and the way it started and the tension it built?
All right, well, there were 2 guys, these 2, I'd seen them before in Sizwa Bansi, so I couldn't wait to see them again. And I went to, I only had one performance of Sizwa Bansi until years later when they brought it back. But then when they came with Hadasha Span, as it was then called, I ran to it, I saw it 2 nights running. John was sitting at the front there, sort of with his knees almost touching mine, and there was, Winston invented a sort of a pile of cement or sand or something, and he was pushing this invisible wheelbarrow from that sand, loading it and dumping it next to John. And this went on for about 5 or 10 minutes. Just this make-believe. And you could see the sand and the sweat dripping off him and the weight of that wheelbarrow as he pushed it backwards and forwards across. He was even making squeaking noises of the wheel. It was just 2 men with nothing else. This is theatre in the raw. This is what theatre should be all about. And it's the first time I'd ever seen it. And I come from a country that has a strong theatrical tradition. I'd never seen this power. So those sort of things were. And again, as you said, the minutiae of oppression, they came out with it. When he talked about the joy in Sizwa Bansi, when Winston, who was a very, very fine actor, when he's sitting down, he's talking about Sky's Place, which is one of the shebeens. He was sitting down and he said, Sky's Place. And he stood on his feet. By the time he was on his feet, he was drunk. And he went into a whole drunken thing about amazing stuff.
The other moment, you know, you mentioned the peeing in his hand, putting in the eye. The other moment was for me was in Sizwa Bansi when Winston, you know, stripped his underpants.
Yeah.
You know, grabbed his genitals
Yeah.
and walked up to a lady from the audience, somebody from Constantia or something, and said, "Am I not a man? Am I not a man?" You remember that?
No, I don't.
But for me, you know, watching those plays, I was interested. I saw Sizwa Bansi every night of his run.
Oh.
And for me, the interesting thing was watching the audience, which was like a third member of the cast.
Yeah.
You know, being confronted with this
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, you, as you say, you were not used to it, but more accustomed to that kind of theatre in Ireland. But here, these liberals, and they're faced with this wham, this fist. You're not allowed a subtle hint or anything like that.
Yeah, Hugo said about one of the writers that he wrote with his arm drawn back. And I think in those days, the black dramatists did that. They were ready to punch you in the face. But I'd never seen this. I was still I came from a very strong theatrical tradition, but it was formal. Proscenium arch, okay? That invisible wall. And there was the whole sort of protocol of theatre. That didn't exist when we saw these black guys come in. Rose Albert, when he comes in, he's making the noise of a helicopter. Coming closer and closer down to the ground. And these two guys running around the stage trying to get away from this fearsome beast that was descending upon them. This was astounding stuff.
Coming from Ireland, then so you must have learned a lot more about South Africa in a very short space of time at this space. Would that be correct?
Yeah, very correct. There was a sort of a willful blindness in this country when I came here. People didn't talk about things, didn't want to know. A willful ignorance, which I found obscene. That when I was, for example, I was swanned up and down to Johannesburg when Steve Biko was beaten to death. I was with the agency and clients. There was about 20 or 30 people sitting around an Italian restaurant called the Courteline in Johannesburg. Wine was flowing, food was piling in, and so they started talking about Biko. And, well, he starved to death. There was all these mad theories that were promulgated, by the authorities. He was on a hunger strike. He'd slipped and banged his head and all. And I was saying nothing. I said to myself all through this, I was eating my pasta, and said, don't say a word, just get your head down. This is not the place for you to say what you think. And then somebody asked me directly, Dermod, what do you think happened? I said, he was beaten to death. Well, the whole time, come on. Nearly 25, 30 people, well-educated, sophisticated, in this state of willful ignorance. It was disgusting. And yet I could go into that in Baton Street, up those god-awful steps up to the theatre, and hear and see the truth.
It was a significant, I would feel, one of the factors there.
Yeah, that's very true. Like the chances I had to write at the space, the brief was to tell the truth. Give us I had a quirky way, and Brian always said I should write reviews, and I thought of that. I flirted with that idea for a while, but theatre in those days didn't pay. But I could write that sort of satire on the situation, and by being outrageous about and telling the truth about people. I mean, I've written some songs in some of those plays that are offended everyone, liberal and conservative, because that's what satire should do. It should offend people because it confronts their fears, their angers, their prejudices in a funny way. And the more outrageous it is, the more you're going to, as I say, write with your arm drawn back, punch them in the face and make them face up to. So there was a lot of that. And when Brian came to me about Lysistrata, he said, I want you to write Lysistrata. Clean it up. We don't want we're taking enough risks. We don't want any foul language. And it's a very dirty play. It's full of all sorts of sexual innuendos. And with the mixture of the couples, because they were all supposed to be married, we're not going to mix the race. We're taking enough risks as it was. So we had sort of a white couple, Indian couple, a coloured couple. We didn't go into that area because the play itself was so outrageous. And I wrote some songs which had all the rude words in there, all the sort of the niggers and the kaffers and the colours and the honkies and all that stuff, threw it all in there and made it rhyme. And that's the way to handle these prejudices. And if I sang those songs now, I wouldn't get away with it. But in those days, because of the situation, this crucible we were in a way it was, I suppose the targets were easier. But I miss it now. I miss that anger now that emanated from and the truth that came from this space theatre and later on the market theatre. I don't see it in theatre now. People are afraid. So what's new? Here we go again. We need another brand of protest theatre to say this is not good enough. This is not what we went through 30 years, 40, 300 years of oppression for. Let's have the satirists. The only one Peter is the only one who's doing it, Peter Suitcase. And he does it because he has that wonderful tightrope he walks on that you can't be offended by it. We need a Lenny Bruce right now to talk about what's going on and what's going wrong. And we had a lot of those.
You're quite passionate about the space.
Yeah, I loved it. I enjoyed every minute of it. When Rob took over the People Space, I got tired of advertising. I went freelance. And he offered me a job as a resident writer. 450 rand a month. I mean, I had 3 kids at school. I was tempted, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. I wanted to very much, and it would have changed my life, but I couldn't do it. I ran this very expensive establishment in the ghetto of Camps Bay, and with a housekeeper and a dog and all attendant.
If I say to you, look, give me 5 words about the space, what would think about it? What were the words you would use to describe?
Courage.
Sorry to start again.
Courage is one. People have the courage to say and write and act things. Truth is another that you're speaking about. A sense of fun and outrageousness. I mean, I had a song called the Grope Areas Act from my Lysistrata. I mean, that's just as ridiculous as the Group Areas Act when you look back in it. But then it was serious stuff. Outrageousness, And as I say, the anger, the arm drawn back bit. I'm being attacked here by a cat. Excuse me.
Okay, so we didn't see the cat, so we'll start again.
Speaking of anger.
Anger. There was a hell of a lot of anger coming out. But it was always presented with this sense of fun. And it was, there was anger on the stage at the subject matter. But I don't remember anyone exchanging crosswords with each other. I don't remember any of the tension that one associates with theatre, and the bitchiness. I got that in other places. I mean, I was in Amdram at the time, and that was terribly limp-wristed and bitchy. But the space wasn't. We all had our tokens. We had the token whitey, we had the token coolie, we had the token kaffir, we had the often coloured, and people laughed out, outrageously at this. But I never remember a crossword being spoken within the people who played there. That's a miracle. I don't know how it happened. Brian, such a benign guy, he laughed. I mean, he was a great director. He laughed all the way through rehearsals, which is one of the reasons why these plays were presented with such fun and such a sort of a giving way, because he was that sort of director. I worked with Charles Common. I did a series of Courteline comedies with Charles, and Charles was also that sort of guy. He'd sit there hosing himself, laughing and he'd say, make it more outrageous, give yourself a fright. How do you give yourself a fright? You give yourself a fright, Years of watching silent slapstick movies, I know how to give myself a fright. That sort of sense of fun and enjoyment. And what did we get paid? Lysistrata ran for 8 weeks. And I wrote it. In royalties, I got 350 rand. We weren't in it for the money.
You were getting a lot more than I was.
Oh, well, I was writing, you see. I ran for 8 weeks. Yours, what? Did any of yours run for it? See, the bitchiness coming in.
No, I don't understand that. I was trying to think of a question which has now escaped me. Yes. The atmosphere in the space itself, I mean, not on the stage necessarily, but was there any feeling of animosity, black towards white or white towards black or anything like that?
None whatsoever. None. We all shared the dressing rooms. We all got to got involved in a play or a review or whatever it was. One of these space benefits, which I used to love. You compared most of them. Where I'd throw a whole lot of sketches together, and get arbitrarily say, okay, you're going to play an Alsatian tonight. Yeah, I'll play an Alsatian tonight, and they would, And one guy would get down on his knees and play an Alsatian. Whether he was black or colour, it didn't matter. There was that sense of camaraderie. And there was a sort of a homegrown quality to it, because I was working. I mean, I was working a full day. And I'd rush down there for rehearsals at 5:30, okay? And I couldn't rehearse any other time. And then I'd rush. I didn't even have time to, when the play was being performed, I didn't have time to go home to eat. I'd grab a sandwich in town and I'd be on the stage at 8 o'clock, 8:30, 7:45 that night. There was that sort of, why? Because, you know, I was given this chance to be at the space, and this opportunity to write or act. I didn't direct, I never directed there.
When you think back now, what do you think the space had? What do you think the effect the space had on South African theatre?
An amazing affair, and it's never been fully recognised. You look at all the swath of great actors that we've had over the past 20 years, 80% of them came from the space. Drama at UCT under, what was her name? Who had the drama? Mavis Taylor. Mavis Taylor. Sorry, Mavis, for getting you. Mavis. And then they'd go to the space, and in a year they would do like major roles. It was like rep. They'd do all the big roles for a year, 2 years, and then they'd go off. And very few of them acknowledged the pivotal part that the space played. The market became a more, this is me being bitchy now about the market, you know, because I'm possessive about the space, you know. The market, it became a hipper place to be. It had more money and bigger audiences. And I dare say, in the overall scheme of things, because it was in the heart of Johannesburg, it was probably in a more pivotal place than the space in Cape Town. But
the effect on theatre generally, I mean, theatre changed after that.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier on, it ushered in the era of the protest theatre, which brought an awful lot of talent out of nowhere, okay? And a lot of those people survived, the people who turned out to be genuine playwrights, as against just angry young men or women, you know? And they're very much part of the fabric. So in that way it changed. It gave these people, coloured and black people, the opportunity to write and to learn the trade of theatre. So that in that way it placed its stamp on theatre. Also the protest theatre, of course, has its own ethic and its own sort of inner energy and its own raison d'etre, and that changed. That the space was the major focal point of that protest theatre until the market took over the baton and carried it further. So in that way it changed it. It also, I think it changed the whole approach to more traditional and more established theatre. Because I think it gave an energy that I saw, for example, 2 weeks ago, I went to see The Tempest. And that Tempest, that Africanized Tempest with John Carney, was a direct, you could trace the antecedents of that play back to the space theatre. That rawness, that energy, that African feel that was there in an awful lot of our plays there. I suppose coming from Europe as I did, with that background in theatre, formal theatre and that, which played an important part in the cultural life, but didn't play a part in the life of Dublin on the street, okay? It hadn't got that quality, grassroots level. It wasn't grassroots theatre. So when I came here, the space was grassroots theatre. It was time and again I'd see in these plays, like I remember, I'm just dipping back into my memory here. I remember a black guy, I'd never seen him before, never saw him since. He came out and he did something with a reed. The only prop he had was a reed. And he told stories about his village somewhere in the Eastern Cape. And this reed featured in every one of them. And that was the only prop he had. And by doing that, he let me into that black world, which I'd never experienced before. I'd never heard of before. And under the apartheid regime, they tried to make sure I wouldn't hear about it. So in that way, it let me into those worlds. Then the rawness that came out of the Cape Flats, that anger that came out, the people talking about the everyday oppression, making that palpable, putting that expression on the stage. Athol did that a lot of times with the fruitlessness of the white, like people are living there, and statements after an arrest under the Immorality Act. And the one thing, that was when he said the dam was dry and I couldn't wash myself before I went to see my lover. Now this, a tiny moment with huge dramatic significance. This sort of stuff came out. And this was new to me as a European, as a white European. They tackled, Rosa Albert tackled the very brutal oppression of the cops in the townships. Other plays tackled what went on in the prisons, how people were beaten and tortured, long before it was made public in any other venue. And what it felt like to be treated like that. What it felt like to be an outcast, a piece of shit on the island. I didn't know that until I met John and Winston. And where in spite of that they put on Antigone in this god-awful place out there, as it was then. So that spirit, and that I relate to. I mean, being Irish, you know, who were called for many decades the niggers of Europe. And I married into a Jewish family, and the whole thing about using humour to make life bearable. That came out of the space. The white people in the formal theatre, in the Baxter and Nico, didn't need that outlet. The people did, the black people and the coloured people needed it. So that put me in touch with the rawness and the pain of society. That all the time the apartheid regime were trying to prevent me learning.
Thanks very much.